Okay, thank you very much, Martin, for an interesting overview of your perspective on the Euro crisis and the European Union. Certainly the theoretical frameworks are very useful. These broad frameworks to try and look at concepts, to go into the meanings of concepts. And I hope one of the things that you raised, both of you raised, is these common rules. How do common rules get formed? What is this deciding together process? And I guess this jump of how was this political economy of debtors versus creditors set up in this system of common rules and deciding together. So thank you both very much for your contributions. I want to open it up to the floor to hear your questions to the speakers, comments, short comments. We can take a round of 3 or 4 questions. Give it back to the speakers and then continue on this basis. So, do we have any burning questions on the floor?
Yeah. So this was a question for Martin. I found it interesting what you're saying about how in the EU deciding things together doesn't necessarily mean that there's lack of democracy. But I was thinking, surely the fact that people in the national states don't have any direct say in what happens in the EU institution, would you not say that points to a lack of democracy?
What is the sort of say you have in mind? Are you British? Just to kind of make it concrete.
Yes,
Yeah. So what's the sort of say you have in the British government that you don't have in the EU?
Well, so obviously I can vote for the government and they represent me in the EU, but I do not have any direct say in what happens directly in the EU. Just because I can vote through the British government isn't quite the same as saying I have a direct say if you get what I'm talking about.
Did you vote in the last European elections?
Yes.
So you wanted to take a couple
I
of
want to
questions?
take a round, if that's okay. Are there any more questions around? Okay, just the two of you, yeah.
I'm interested in the European Stability Mechanism. Wondering if you think there's or it seems to be one very technocratically, with a great democratic deficit, not much input from the European Parliament, for example. Do you think what ways do you think we can improve that democratic deficit in the European Stability Mechanism?
I have a question to John. But you said that better regulation agenda in the EU is about deregulation, pro-business, not taking into account environmental and social impacts. But as far as I know, better regulation agenda is actually the opposite, taking actually a holistic view, and that's why they have these impact assessments that need to take into account all kinds of impacts that deregulations have. So I would like to know on what basis to make that argument.
Okay, let's give it to the speakers, maybe to John first and then Martin.
Yeah, since I made a false start, didn't I? Sorry. But just on the first thing, well, you obviously have some say in that you elect someone to the European Parliament, and they are a lot more powerful than people think. You can try and hold them to account as much as you would hold your Westminster MP to account. I don't know what you do if your Westminster MP isn't the one you voted for, or if they do something you don't like. These are problems in any kind of democracy, right? Now, I accept the distance is much further. Of course it is. But I don't see how you get around that if you think it's good for Europeans to try to have some common rules. Now, you may not think that, in which case, sure, it might be better to just decide everything locally rather than in some sort of horse trading compromise between national politicians with the input from the Commission that will try to broker something that they think can go through. They'll obviously push as much as they can for what they want. That's politics. But I don't see how you get around that if you think it's a good idea to have common rules, right? If you have common rules, then others will have a say too, and your say will be, proportionally, if you like, way less. But you can't say that is less democratic. You can say it's the wrong way to go to make common rules with others. We should all have separate rules. and you happy to take the consequences of that. I wouldn't be. I think it makes sense to have a lot of common rules. But if you want common rules, I'm not sure how, in a larger governed space, well, yeah, the distances will be longer. We should do everything we can to minimize that distance, but yeah, a space of 500 people is, it's harder to govern than a space of 50 million. On the ESM, the European Stability Mechanism, that's the sort of fund through which Eurozone states have bailed out Greece and Ireland and Portugal and Cyprus. I think it was wrong to bail them out to begin with, because what that does is to create this creditor-debtor relationship between nation states, which is harmful, politically toxic. It's been poisoned. So I don't think we should have had it in the first place. Well, once you have it, well, naturally, it is a tool for enforcing the conditions of the creditors. So, yeah, no, in that sense, it's not very democratic. But again, that has to do with how a debt can reduce sovereignty. That's a bad thing, I agree.
Can I come back on this as well? I mean, to go to the first thing, I do disagree with Martin in respect of this question of an automatic sort of comparison between our voting for parties here and our voting in the European space. And I had this sort of absolutely bitter experience of beating my head for 20 years against the European Union's trade policy and finding exactly this problem. When we vote people back to Westminster, we each vote in our constituencies. So I'll vote in Wandsworth, you'll vote in Richmond, somebody else will vote in Harrogate, we vote like that. But we're voting for the same parties on the list. And that means that if together we all vote for these parties, they will then form the government. That's not the same in either the European Council, where we have to vote for one group, even if we have the best UK government. Actually, let's not use the UK because we're never going to have a really very good one. But let's say the Greek people vote for Syriza, and everyone goes yes. Or indeed the Spanish vote for Podemos, and the Portuguese vote for the Left Bloc, and the French vote for the Parti de Gauche, and we can all, dream. Even then, you find that they don't have the power to stand up to the other ones. So we are disenfranchised at that level. Within the European Parliament, it's much, much worse. And we've done this literally for the last year, trying to push people on the TTIP resolution, which was before the European Parliament in July of last year. And we put huge pressure on the Labour MEPs, and we managed to get them to shift their position. So we had the fullest impact in terms of our democratic accountability of our MEPs. But the German Social Democrats and the Italians had already done a deal to form their own grand coalition with the Conservatives and the Liberals. So they said, we don't care about your views. And they managed to swish all of it through. And we have absolutely no say over them whatsoever. And this is, I think, about more than just a distinction of distance. This is about a structural inability to control, which is different from here. Yes, here we have 650 MPs from all different parts of the country. The Tories are about to make it 600 so that they can get rid of some of the Labour ones. And then they're part of the same system. That's the difference, I think. We can't vote for the Finnish or the Latvian or the Maltese representative. They are all from different parties. We have no participation in that. So that's a bit of a difference there. The ESM, interestingly, I think it was precisely this which was being discussed within the context of the Plan B debates in Madrid and Paris. And here I think it's really important to remember, it's not just really about the international relations between creditor states and debtor states. The bailout that went to Greece went straight out again. 90% went straight back to the German banks and the French banks. So it's not actually Germany bailing out Greece. It's the people of Europe bailing out the banks again.
That's my right.
In exactly the same way again, which happened with Ireland. And with Ireland, you had an absolutely stark choice. You had a government which was considering forcing the bondholders to take a haircut, as they say, so that actually you're putting a bit of pain on those who are just speculating and making more and more money out of the accumulation of capital. And it was the Troika which came in and said, no way. Who is the Troika? The IMF, unelected, unaccountable. The European Central Bank, unelected, unaccountable. The European Commission, unelected, unaccountable. And that is a recipe for complete anti-democratic nightmare. And that's what the Irish people had to do. So the Irish people get told, you will bear the brunt of this, pain of it's all going to go on you through permanent austerity, and all of the bankers can continue buying yachts and villas in the Bahamas until they can't get enough of them. Until let's just quickly come back on the better regulation agenda, which we actually know through the fact that it was the Labour Party which originally coined the concept of better regulation here, and they set up a better regulation executive within the Cabinet Office, which is the sort of gatekeeper of all legislation going through. And whenever you had legislation which looked as if it was going to introduce new rules, they stopped it, because they said better regulation is about reducing the burden. And that's exactly the same language which has been used by the European Commission. And particularly this new way of saying that for every €1 of additional burden of regulation on business, if you introduce a rule which would be worth €1 of regulation, you have to have 2 taken away. So this constant reducing of the burden. And that seems to me to be a complete reversal of what was there before within the European Union, where it was genuinely saying, let's look around for a levelling up. Now what we're being told, absolutely explicitly by our government, is that it's not about raising standards. In order to be competitive, you have to reduce the burden on business. And that's what we've seen certainly through the Global Europe agenda of the trade treaties, but now absolutely explicitly through TTIP. They're saying, yeah, it would be possible if you started with a different logic to have a positive outcome of this. If we were negotiating TTIP with our brothers and sisters from the USA, we would start by saying, ramp up all of the standards and the regulations. And exactly as Martin says, on globalization, we would say, well, we want to do it in a different way. We're not saying North Korea is a great model for anybody to follow, but we are saying that we can determine the terms and conditions under which we trade and invest. And the technocratic revolution is not about technical choices. It's about the rule of that deregulation approach, the transformation so that the political discussion about whether you should or shouldn't have these terms and conditions on capital gets swept away. And then just the tiny sort of example of that. Whenever we talk to the promoters, the proponents of TTIP, they say, well, look, we're talking about technical revolution. In the European Union, if you have a washing machine, the flex which connects it to the electricity has to be 1 meter long. In the USA, it's a yard long, which is that different. And they're saying, we want to have this trade agreement to iron out that difference. You say, knock yourselves out. You know, you don't need to have a massive, great big trade treaty. Just cut it in 2, half the difference. Nobody cares. It's not the point. What they're actually talking about is GMOs. Big discussions about whether or not we should have GMOs in Europe. 70% of all processed food in the USA in their supermarkets contains GM ingredients, and people in Europe don't want it. But that's technocracy, because the US is saying, under free trade, you don't get to choose. Hormones in beef. 90% of all US beef is produced using growth hormones. They're banned in Europe because they're carcinogenic. The US say, no, 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 no. Under science-based rules, technocracy, you don't get to choose. Get with the program. We eat it, you eat it. And there's massive, massive examples like that. So I think that's technocracy, is where you move from the washing machine flex to the key issues of how we will control trade and investment so that it is, to use the Polanyian, how do you say the adjective? Polanyian. From Karl Polanyi's term, you embed it within our social mores. You don't let it sort of float off into its own free-floating world of capitalism.
Thank you. Do you want
Can I follow up?
Yes, of course, and we can then go back to any more comments and questions.
Yeah. Look, I think you too often conflate a lack of democracy with outcomes you don't like. Not always, but sometimes. I'll start with one of the points you make where we agree the most, I think, which is the Irish case. It's quite true. Ireland was forced to bail out its banks after it had voluntarily done so for a while, but it was starting to change, and it was told it shouldn't do that. Interestingly, the IMF is the hero of this story, because the IMF was trying to say, no, this has to be written down, but kind of let itself be overruled by the others. The villain is the ECB. And here, I agree, there is a real problem of democracy in how the European Central Bank has acted, because time and time again in the Eurozone crisis, the European Central Bank has said, you have to do this or that, far beyond the mandate they've been given, which is a democratically given mandate, but into decisions about fiscal redistribution, structural reforms, and in particular this question of whether you should bail out the banks. And the threat, because think about this. So in Ireland in 2010, it was sort of golden shackles, right? If you want a bailout, you need to accept these conditions. But why did they accept a bailout? Up until the sort of last day, the Irish government said, well, we don't want it, and we don't need it, because we don't need to borrow any money for it was something like 6 months or 10 months. And I remember at the time writing leaders for the FT saying they shouldn't, right? They should write down the debt in the banks. It wasn't obvious at the time, but it's become clear later that what happened was that the European Central Bank said, you do this or we'll cut off all funding to your banks, we'll kill your banking system. The same threat happened in Portugal a couple of months later. It happened in Cyprus, although with the opposite sign. In Cyprus they said, unless you write down the credit is in your banks, we will kill your banking system. So in that, it was undemocratic, but it was the right policy, in my view. And of course in Greece last year, it was very much that. Greece could, there would have been a lot of pain, but they could have said, well, we're just going to default. The much more difficult thing would be that it seemed like the European Central Bank might then just kill the whole banking system. With that, you sort of kill the economy. So I agree that the ECB has vastly abused its powers. It's got better, but that is a big problem. Of course, it did happen because the countries let themselves get into those debt relationships, but I agree, that's undemocratic. But your other example, so the Labour MEPs and TTIP, I'm sorry, you just didn't have the numbers, right? The German Social Democrats aren't less democratic than the UK Labour Party.
We don't have any access to them. I think that was...
No, you don't, but Germans do.
Yeah, we're working with them all the time.
Very good.
For us, then, that's the issue.
But it's not undemocratic that UK activists, or even the UK Labour Party, can't decide the European policy if you think there should be a European policy.
It is a constriction of our democracy. That's the thing.
Okay, let's put it in a, sorry to interrupt this point. Perhaps the question is about whether we are as free and equal against these rules and in making these rules as we would like to think, because I think that's one of the things that I can distinguish, is whether all social groups have equal power in creating the rules, and, for example, a small activist group has the same representation in creating the common rules that we all decide together as, for example, the massive lobbyists or the big corporations in deciding the rules. And I think this has been one of the issues that has been at the centre of some of this, how EU policy is actually created. And perhaps there's this sense of what accessibility do different social groups have to those kind of rule-making processes in the EU. So I'm just perhaps teasing out something there about this issue. Is it okay if we go back to the floor to see if there's any more comments and questions? So we have two. Yeah, let's start with the back.
Yeah, it was just on the point that was just being made about whether these are our representatives. Because I don't think that problem, if it isn't something that's unique to Europe, because if you're a voter in Scotland at the moment, you've overwhelmingly voted for a party that can vote any way it likes in our British National Parliament. But ultimately, if the majority government, which is effectively English, votes the other way, Scotland's voice is heard. And I just wonder whether that's an inevitable consequence, as Martin was saying, of pooling your democracy. The larger the area, the less likely it is that your local view will be policy.
Yeah.
Question about the transparency in the council. There's 28 member states at the moment, and as John pointed out, the UK only has one ward over there. But because a lot of the horse trading is done behind closed doors and not shown in the minutes later on who suggested what or how did they vote, there's a problem of showing accountability to the national executives representing their peoples in the council. Could that actually, if that would be changed somehow, would it help?
Do we have any more comments or ideas or questions for our speakers? Yep.
This is John. I just want to say thank you very much to both of you, Martin and John. It was very, very good to Christina. I am on the MA Diplomacy course at SOAS, and we have to write a speech next week, 3 minutes, so we're watching you both very, very much taking notes. I, by default, ended up at a grassroots campaign about 4 weeks ago that had a cross-party panel from George Galloway and Nigel Farage to Kate Cowie and the rest, and I ended up being on TV, but I'm a Conservative Party, One Nation, as a student. There aren't many of us at SOAS. And so basically, I ended up at the end of this campaign standing up and giving a standing ovation to George Galloway, who I know various people don't like him, I know he's a very bad man. But what he had to say was so encapsulating to the audience that lots of people got up and were interested. So I won't go on too long-winded because David Cameron was in Brussels at the time and was negotiating. I subsequently, having heard what the Brexit campaigners had to say, very, very much for the whole national sovereignty, the fact that we should have our own laws, we should be able to govern ourselves, I get all of that. The reason I'm sort of writing a speech to stay in is because I think of the history that we've got. So I think Martin was from Norway, which is not in the EU. So this was the whole thing where when we were in Geneva recently with the with WIPO and various other groups that were talking about TTIP. Farage was saying that TTIP was something that we shouldn't be getting involved in because it was very much like the EU, and he was saying it was all corrupt, and what we needed to do was have bilateral agreements with nation states, that we were capable of doing it like Switzerland, that we were capable of doing it like Norway and Finland. But for some reason there seems to be all this fear. The pound went down, there were people saying that there was going to be lots of car exports, all trade's going to be affected. So what is the reality? Should we have this fire in our belly that we should be maintaining our rules and maintaining our laws, or should we be doing what our learned comrade here is saying, which is that we've got this system, what we perhaps need to do is fix it, and how do we go about making those reforms? What do we need to do before June, that referendum to be in?
Great.
That's a big one.
Can I start back on that one? Because can I go backwards through the question?
Of course, as you like.
Because on that one, I think it's a really good point. George Galloway, for interest, used to do my job at War a Month. He was the director of War a Month back in the day. And it was quite funny because he was on the Daily Politics show on BBC just after that event, having an absolute ding-dong with the BBC reporter going over it, and kept on saying, everybody left when you started speaking. And he said, I'm not here to discuss ridiculous little things like that. I'm here to discuss the EU referendum. So we had a real fight, and I was on immediately afterwards. It was really terribly difficult. How do we fix it? And I think that's absolutely right. The people who are looking from the perspective of wanting to stay in, certainly most people from the left, and I think most people from all sides, are saying there is something fundamentally wrong in the European Union. And then the question is, do you believe it is reformable? Do you believe you can fix the institutions? And that's the big question which we're asking to people. Because you get a lot of people from the more liberal, green, left side who will say, we've got to be in it to fix it. And it sounds lovely. But if you've actually had the hard experience of trying to shift those institutions, you'll know that actually there is a solid block at the centre of Europe which is unreformable. And that's interesting because more and more people are seeing that about the euro. Certainly the Plan B stuff is saying the euro is unreformable. It's structurally committed towards the supremacy of Germany to the detriment of everybody else. So we need to have, what they're saying now is a shift back to some form of the exchange rate mechanism from before, or some sort of virtual thing where you have parallel currencies or back to national currencies, whatever it may be. But they're all saying you have to have a rupture with the institutions to create the space for something positive. And I think that's the debate, really. If you believe that the institutions are reformable, then I think that's a very compelling reason to vote in. But if you think that they're just genuinely not, because the treaties of the European Union, as set out, preclude that option, then you've got a different response. The UKIP stuff's fascinating on TTIP. UKIP love TTIP. They love the fact that it's anti-labour, it's anti the environment, it's against public health, it's against public safety. They love everything in it. They just hate the fact that it's Brussels negotiating it and not Westminster. And I won't go on too much about TTIP because it just raises everybody's blood pressure. Transparency, to go back sort of in the reverse order for the things, it would certainly help. I mean, I remember when they were having the debates on the WTO, the World Trade Organization, about 10 years ago, and it was then the new Labour government, and they would say to us in these very sort of heart-to-heart meetings, we've really been pushing absolutely hard for all the things you've been saying in Council. And then we get all these reports from all of the other countries saying, the UK government did exactly the opposite. They're absolutely lying through their teeth. And of course the great thing about these untransparent bodies is that they can just submerge everything. We have a nice, very, very luckily, we have access to some of the cables which come out intra-governmental cables from other countries, so we can see the positions being taken by governments.
Not to mention the FT's fine Brussels Bureau.
The excellent FT Brussels Bureau, without which I'm sure that there'll be even less transparency in the European Union. Varoufakis is pushing for transparency. It's the thing at the basis of his DM25, the Democracy in Europe movement by 2025. It's the lowest possible thing you can push for. It won't really, I think, make any difference. But it's a nice thing. But I don't think it will really.
Can I just insert my thoughts on this particular question? Because I agree, more transparency would be great. I'm skeptical that it would be workable if you did make public these discussions. The real discussions would happen elsewhere. People will find a way around it. That's not a reason not to do it. I just want to note that UK cabinet meetings are not public, right? You can't go to the cabinet or the government website and see the streaming of the cabinet meeting. Is that undemocratic? You can see the argument for keeping the conversation private. I don't know that it's undemocratic. I think it'd be a good thing with more transparency. I work for a newspaper, we'd love it.
But you can see the
but it's not. Yeah, no, absolutely. I'm just saying this isn't any different at the Westminster level or the Brussels level. If anything, it's more transparent in Brussels precisely because you have so many opposing interests. It's not a team of collective responsibility.
But the Tories, I don't care whether Ian Duncan Smith agrees with David Cameron, who doesn't agree with Michael Gove. I don't care. It makes no difference to me. But you get one thing out of the Conservative government who you voted for. Well, in most cases haven't. Well, some cases have. And you can see what it is. So there is a direct line there. I can hold every single one of them around the table responsible. And in the EU Council, that's the problem. I have absolutely no democratic route to the Latvian government. That's my problem. And it does go back to your question around the Scots nationalists, for example. And I think it's exactly the same sort of principle. If the Scots nationalists were to hold, to stand candidates in all of the seats all the way across Britain, and indeed the north of Ireland, then it would be a different situation. They've decided just to sort of run in Scotland, and therefore they are, to an extent, exposed in that way. So I do see that is the same sort of problem. Whereas if you're looking within Holyrood, and the election which will come on the 5th of May for the Scottish Parliament, then it's a slightly different issue. But again, you can then within your constituency, and indeed within a fairly big bulk of Britain, you can vote in that way. But I think that the tensions are exactly the same tensions, and that's what was reclaimed in the Scottish referendum. And maybe it is. I mean, that's one of the other things that Polanyi really did say, that the more you get this integration within bigger and bigger spaces, the further away it is from people, exactly as you were saying, Martin. So there is a sort of a physical thing in that respect, and it is a real physical thing. We do take demos to Brussels. You know, we have people going and protesting in Brussels, but it's a great deal easier to take people to the Tory conference in Manchester like last year than to get everybody schlepping over to Brussels. And I suppose it's the same thing as if you're in Indiana and you've raised a little militia to try and fight the federal government. It's easier to do it locally than to all schlep off to Washington DC and do it.
Just on the Scotland comparison, I mean, I think it's a good point. I think it's partly made worse by the UK electoral system. With PR, they would probably have a bit more say, because some coalition would have to be formed and so on. But the problem, if you look at Scotland, well, the question is, do you expect that consistently in the long run there'll be very diverging preferences among most Scots and most English on what the common rules should be, to such an extent, consistently and diverging enough that it's better not to have common rules at all, in which case the obvious solution is independence. If you don't think that, and that's kind of parallel in the European case, you need to decide, well, how important is it for us to have common rules? You know, maybe we shouldn't have common rules at all the detailed levels we have now. There should be more subsidiarity. But on the whole, do you want a commonly governed space or not? If you think that's a good thing, then you make it as democratic as you can. But you know, you can't really overcome the distance, and you certainly can't say that because one political movement in one country can't tip the outcome, that's a democratic problem. That means everyone has to unite at the activism level too. What has to be done for the vote to go in? There are two very different kinds of conservatism, right? You said you're a conservative. So there are two very different kinds. I think every conservative party in the world struggles with this. There's a sort of conservatism of tradition and how one used to govern oneself, and there's a conservatism of largely individual freedom, including economic freedoms. The trading conservatism, if you like, with the tradition conservatism. Every conservative party struggles with that tension. So I guess you need to know which one you think is more important. But to the extent that, like many conservatives, you do believe in a lot of economic integration with other countries, a lot of trade, then it seems to me that you would want to... Democracy is about maximizing the influence you can have on the conditions under which that trade happens. The Norway option certainly is not that. That's accepting all the rules without any say. You know, some sort of free trade arrangement. You could probably have more national autonomy, but you would also cover less trade. You know, if it's both TTIP and most bilateral trade treaties have, you know, there is an undemocratic element, which is these state investor dispute bodies. I think national courts are much better, but that's something one can negotiate. I just reread, it was sort of circulating inside the FT, the leader article that the Financial Times wrote in 1975 about the referendum then. The FT was for staying inside, the same now. But what was interesting was just how much of that full length, you know, all the way down the page, leader article, could run it pretty much exactly the same today. Maybe replace the reference to the Soviet Union with a reference to Putin. But there was one thing that was included then that I haven't seen in the debate now, and that was the idea that the UK has a contribution to make. It's not only self-interest, it's also a sense of the common interest of Europe, to which any great nation, and indeed any small nation, may have a contribution to make. That question hasn't been raised in this debate. Does the UK...
Nobody could claim that now with a serious face.
Does the UK... Well, given the history, it's hard. But as individual citizens, I think everyone needs to ask themselves, well, is there a responsibility for the UK here too?
It's usually the other way around, I think, now, that people feel that it would be the greatest gift that the British people could give to the people of Europe is to leave the European Union.
That's not what you can do for Europe, but what Europe can do for you.
Yep.
Which was just, can I ask you your opinion on whether or not you think that Boris Johnson's idea that we'll lose 3 million jobs if we leave the EU is feasible in the city?
I think Boris Johnson has a lot in common with Donald Trump. Not just the hair. Boris Johnson's a lot smarter than Donald Trump and a lot more knowledgeable. He is, of course, a US citizen and bred in Brussels. You know, he's a citizen of the world. But what he has in common with Donald Trump, I think, is a nonchalance, to put it mildly, with the truth in the service of his own positioning. It's very clearly established that, he's admitted it himself, that Boris Johnson used his Telegraph career to write outrageous stories about Brussels. There's this funny story about how he once arrived late to a press briefing and said, "So what's going on and how is it bad for Britain?" He spouted a lot of false claims, okay? So I wouldn't take anything he says particularly seriously. And I also think that, you know, he probably wants to have a high-profile role in the No campaign, the Leave campaign, but he probably wants then, as he has sort of said, to negotiate another way of staying in. So, no, I wouldn't believe the claim about 3 million jobs because I wouldn't believe any of his claims. But I also wouldn't believe any claim about 3 million jobs either way. I mean, Nick Clegg has made similar points on the other side. We just don't know. It could be a bit, you know, short-term, probably not so good. Long-term, nobody knows. Generally, I tend to think that it's bad for economics to divide things up and erect barriers rather than the opposite. So my take is it's probably bad economically, but it's a political question.
Okay, thanks very much. I just wanted to just draw something out which has been talked about by both of you and by people on the floor, which is the common starting point seems to be this general what is the EU / what could the EU be versus what did we actually see in practice since the EU crisis management started being unfolding. And I think there is a sort of common agreement that the crisis management in inverted commas, because the situation has definitely deteriorated, has been done in an undemocratic way, or has been done in ways which isn't going to be, which leaves much to be desired. And we've already talked about the ECB's mandate being overstepped through pressure, direct or indirect, on national governments to accept bailout mechanisms, using the threat of the financial system being deprived of liquidity, the banking system being deprived of liquidity. We've talked about how the stopgap measures, which then end up being permanently instituted as the ESM, being derived from this wrong decision. What was a wrong decision to bail out the banks via the state, so give money to the government so the governments can pay their creditors, which at the time were the big private European banks. So this was a wrong decision from which then we can see all of these undemocratic problems playing out on the EU level. So I think the thing that I want to sort of draw out is, well, why did that wrong decision happen? In the sense that we have seen numerous times EU... let me give you an example. When the debt restructuring programme for Greece was being decided between 2011 and 12, which was when the notorious referendum proposal by Papandreou fell through, and a technocratic government was put in place. So here we have this divide between technocratic bureaucrats in Brussels and domestic civil servants versus technocratic governments being put in place, admittedly, or by what many people thought was the creditors themselves, in order to carry forward these agreements. At that point, we had banking sector interest, the IIF, actually helping to break the deadlock of those policymakers about what that agreement should be. So how do we understand these negotiating powers coming to secure a new deal for the second bailout for Greece, let's say the bankers' union very much helped to provide the blueprint for what that restructuring would be, how do we understand the deadlock arising at the European political level being helped and assisted by financial interests directly? So I have this question. How is this to be understood? And how is it to be understood this, we've been talking a lot about technocracy, the benefits of technocracy when we're talking about, leave it up to the technocrats to decide the length of the cable. But we have had a series of examples in the last few years of technocratic governments being put in place, and a lot of political instability. There have been 5 or 6 governments coming and going in Greece in the space of 6 years. And in the last case, the political will of that government being very harshly resisted by the European authorities. So in what frame can we understand sovereignty, popular mandates, the ECB's power to, when we're talking about, again, in the context of the referendum, under what conditions will England be voting in, the UK be voting in? Greece voted their referendum with the banks closed and capital controls. That had been enforced by the ECB, cutting liquidity. So what are the frames of democracy? Under what conditions are we free to choose our futures if the banks are closed and there's no money in the ATM? So just to open it out and to kind of draw out these issues again from the discussion, I don't know if you would like to comment on this, or if we have more issues, more points from the floor.
Maybe I can say a few words, because you or someone in the audience also earlier asked about whether there's sort of free and equal influence among various groups in society. I think this is related. The answer is clearly no. And that's a flaw in national democracies too. Electoral democracy doesn't mean equal influence by all citizens, unfortunately. Maybe one question to ask is about the Papandreou story. So what happened was that Papandreou sprung it as a bit of a surprise on both other European countries and I think his own government, if I remember right, that he would have a referendum on the second bailout that had a debt restructuring in it, early November 2011. And he was sort of called in schoolmasterly by Merkel and Sarkozy, who yelled at him and said, you can't do this, and so on. But I think it's important to ask the question, this was still the elected Prime Minister of Greece. There's no question that he had the authority legally to call the referendum. He chose not to, right? So why did he choose not to? Well, there's obviously pressure from the outside. A big part of it was that it seems like he was stabbed in the back by Venizelos, who I guess was the finance minister at the time, who wanted the top job himself. There was a lot of internal politicking. But ultimately, he chose to withdraw it, and he lost his parliamentary support, and a new government was voted in or supported with a majority in parliament, right? The scandal in Italy around the same time where Berlusconi was squeezed out. Again, there was outside pressure, but he lost his parliamentary support. So these were terrible pressures against democracy, but still it was national politics that kind of called the day. It was that the horse trading that happens between politicians at the national level, whoever the power brokers are, who aren't necessarily the same as the elected people in elected office, decided to side with the preference of the larger European countries. Why was that? Well, two questions. Why did they do that, and why did the larger European powers pressure for just that? And I think the role of banks is very important. I think what we have is democratically elected governments very often following the interest of banks. It's quite true. And let me offer a heretical thought. There's a reason why national governments so often act in the interest of their banks. It's because national banking systems and national political elites are very much intertwined at the national level, okay? Most banks in Europe are nationally headquartered banks. They have long-standing relationships. These are people who know each other. Banks are sometimes formally, sometimes informally seen as some extension of national policy, credit policy. It's very powerful to be able to channel funding the direction you want. And you see it at the most egregious level in places like Ireland and Spain, where you had these huge property bubbles that benefited both banks and the parties in power while it lasted. The heretical thought I want to offer then is that the movement towards greater integration of banking regulation in Europe at the pan-European level, Eurozone and most of the EU, which is both technocratic, it's supranational, is actually going to have the effect, or at least it's our best hope, for breaking that nexus at the national level between national political elites and national banking elites. Because it will stop governments from favoring their own banks, and it will also stop the banks from favoring their own governments. That's part of the purpose. So here's an example I would like to suggest, we'll see how it plays out, where more European technocracy will actually improve national democracy.
Can I give exactly the opposite position?
Please do.
Because I think that it's not just at the national level. Obviously, for many sort of neoclassical economists, they want to sort of remove that national level linkage, but they don't necessarily see the transnational capitalist class working with exactly the same level of interconnectedness. And I think that's where it's not that technocracy isn't political, it's that it has the appearance of not being political. So what technocracy does is it imposes a particular solution as if it is the only solution that you could possibly hold, which would be economically sustainable, legitimate, establishment or whatever. And I think that that's part of the issue. It was interesting in the Plan B discussions, everybody was saying you need to re-establish national central banks in the way in which they were originally conceived, i.e. being institutions which are political, so brought back under political control, not with this semblance of independence, and instead that they are responsible for managing national debt. So that becomes a way in which you do it. And it could well be in the more extreme ways, like Ecuador, for example, to take an extra EU example, went through exactly that, went through a debt audit, wrote down its debt, straight back again. Argentina with a slightly different model, a very, very short period of pain, and straight back again, which obviously from the outside, everybody was screaming at Greece to say default, 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 go through the pain and come out again at the other side. But there were obviously different political and historical things there. And I think that, to go back to the bigger question, under what conditions are we voting here? In a way, Britain is voting in a position of incredible privilege in our referendum in comparison to Greece. All of the aspects. We're not going to a situation where we go to the bank and there's no money in the ATM. We're not being told you have 40 euros a week or whatever it may be you can take out. And we also have absolutely no conception here of the reality of the refugee presence that there is in the rest of Europe. I was in Frankfurt the week before last, and even on the platforms of Frankfurt station, you've got a huge physical presence of people who've come out of the war zones and stuff. Britain is incredibly cocooned from the rest of Europe in that respect. So I think we're voting in a position of great privilege. And I hope that by continuing the debate, we begin to see some of the more profound choices that actually are coming in the European context.
Okay, that's a nice close. Are there any final comments or questions? Any burning desires or questions for the speakers? If there's one.
Hi, yeah, you're right. I wanted to talk about the sovereignty of the UK in terms of the UK. And I'm not going to be an expert, but I believe that there's no doubt that the UK is still originally more sovereignty. And this is because, I could argue that through the enactment of the European Communities Act of 1972, it was Parliament's intention to bind this country in the EU on conflicting laws, to bind the the UK on EU conflicting laws with UK laws, and which obviously can be expressed in repeal. Does this not purport to protect individuals, especially when the EU can place checks and balances upon the UK and hold the state liable for any contraventions or injustices? Does this not also strengthen the historical context of John Locke's social contract between the individual and the state, therefore in a sense safeguarding democracy? Parliament can still enact laws which can actually improve or fix the UK's position within the EU, because ultimately they still hold sovereignty through the ECA. Membership in this sense would not seem to be a problem, and can be done through express repeal of the constitutional statute. I think the ECA has also protected people in the past as well. I mean, there's cases like the Backton case that we had in the UK. I think leaving the European Union would also on the outset mainly just affect corporations and not really individuals. So in a sense, I still believe that being in the UK, being in the EU is actually protecting individuals more so than corporations, and by leaving it, it's going to bring more of a turmoil on people as opposed to corporations. How would you guys respond to that?
Let me just say one thing back on that. I think one of the things we've tried to say from the War on is if you are thinking, if people suggest that by leaving the European Union things are going to get better, that's a myth. Because we have the most rabidly neoliberal government and indeed country of all the European countries. So I don't think anybody needs to feel that there's a great choice I'm offering here. You're either in the European Union and it's going, to hell in a handcart, or you're in the UK and it's going to hell in a handcart. And it's just a question of whether you feel you've got any control of it, which is really the big thing. So I think that on that basis, nobody should be under any false illusion. But I do think that there is a necessary handing over of sovereignty as part of the UK's membership of the European Union, because with the Treaty of Lisbon and all of the previous treaties, more and more powers are indeed ceded to Brussels. So the work which I do on the trade and investment policy, Britain no longer has a trade and investment policy. Britain's relations with the rest of the world are no longer a matter for our government. It's all routed through Brussels. So I think you'll find that more and more of those things, which traditionally have seemed pretty obscure, pretty distant, they might deal with some of the profits of a big multinational corporation, but people haven't seen them really as being our issues, are now being made much more real. Because it's precisely cases like these investment courts, where US corporations, if TTIP goes through, will be able to sue the UK government for introducing rules to try and stop people smoking. We don't have any control of that. That's something which has gone through Brussels. And my final comment on all of this is this. I had a private meeting with the European Commissioner on Trade in her office in Brussels. And I said to her, everybody's against you on this. The whole of Europe's against you. You've had this consultation. You've got 150,000 people responded to your consultation. Over 97% said they didn't like what you're doing. What legitimacy do you have? And she said, I do not take my mandate from the European people. And that is the Commission. That is it. That is the power we've given to them. And yes, there are secondary checks and balances. It goes through the European Parliament. And the European Parliament has a take it or leave it vote. They're not allowed to get involved in any of the negotiations. But the power that we've given is a massive transfer of sovereignty. So I don't think we can escape that. It's then just a question of whether you feel that you can get enough back and whether indeed you consider it to be worth giving up your sovereignty.
On a very legal level, I think you're quite right on sovereignty. Parliament could abolish the European Communities Act today. You can legally leave treaties, and of course there is a provision in the EU treaty for leaving. So legally speaking, sovereignty is in Parliament. In a narrow political sense, I agree with you. Of course, a lot of decisions aren't made there. They're made in the Commission, in the European Council, in the European Parliament. and with all kinds of political processes, formal and informal, including your lobbying with the Commission, right? That's all part of politics. And because these are common rules, they happen at a common level. So in that sense, in that narrow political sense, there is less national sovereignty. But I think what matters most is this notion of sovereignty as governing yourself, right? Self-government. Surely that's what both the legal and political notions are for in the end, right? It's to have influence over the world around you and the lives we live. And it's often the case that by binding ourselves to certain rules, we enhance our self-government. I mean, when technocracy is done well, that's how it works. It gives predictability. It means that everyone knows what to expect. It means that you know that you won't be electrocuted by a washing machine. You took the washing machine example, right? But that's because of technocratic rules that have been put in place. You don't actually have to be an electrician to check whether it's safe, right?
Technical rules, not technocratic rules.
Well, but technical rules are governed by technocracy. That's what technocracy means.
Not really. I think that's the difference.
I do agree with you that technocracy is political. Of course it's political, because it affects real power relations. But sometimes binding ourselves to rules, sometimes, not always, but sometimes binding ourselves can enhance our self-government. When we enter agreements with one another, when we make commitments for the long term, when we make promises, we enable ourselves to do things together that we couldn't otherwise do. And of course, national democracy in some ways restricts what we can individually do. That's what laws are, but it enhances our control over our life together. So the real question is, in the world as it is today, does the UK have more of that real influence on how things go by being a member of the European Union or not? That's what the question has to be. And I think at a more general level, do you have more self-government by making rules together with others? To me, the answer seems overwhelmingly yes. Then the question to ask, well, does the EU, as it is actually constituted, really existing European integration, as it were, does it carry out that possibility in a satisfactory way? Not the best possible way, of course. It needs to be improved. I don't think the sort of reforms the government called for were necessarily good ones. But they illustrate one thing, which is how much influence the UK actually does have. The government decided to spend all its political capital on getting concessions, supposedly, in these 4 domains. Those were not huge, but they took a lot to get, right? It was a huge hassle for everybody else who has a Eurozone crisis and a migration crisis and Ukraine on their hands. I mean, it was totally unnecessary. But he got it, right? And if you look back, and you actually look at what happens rather than what's reported in most of the press, the UK has had a lot of influence over the way the EU has gone. The single market was, to a large extent, Margaret Thatcher's achievement. So, you might not agree with how that influence was used, but that's a different question from whether there's a loss of real sovereignty, real self-government. I think there's a lot of more enhanced self-government by working together. And, well, whether the governments over the years have used that influence in a wise way, that's for citizens to judge. But don't blame the structures for that.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you.
Well, let's give a round of applause to our speakers. Yeah, thank you very much. I think we achieved the primary aim, which was to educate ourselves and to educate all of us here on these issues, and to have the time to really sit and go into these both very practical realpolitik issues, but these broader theoretical and philosophical notions and the content of the notions that get thrown around every day. So thank you very much for coming. Thank you again very much to our speakers for being here, and to the Open Economics Forum for hosting the event. And a small shout out for the next event of Open Economics Forum is in 2 weeks on changing UK, on challenging current UK policies It's co-organised with the Economics Department at SOAS and the International Initiative for the Promotion of Political Economy. It will be taking place in this room. So if you look onto the Open Economics Forum's site, you'll see notification of it. So please take some documents that we have, which are from both of our speakers, representing some good descriptions of some of the problems we've been talking about today. And thank you again to the speakers for coming and to you for being here as well.
Can we just say thank you to Christina as well?
Yeah.
To Ruben.